Hello everybody, Steve Godson here, and I want to talk through the film 33 Postcards, which is a Chinese and Australian co-production. And I really want to talk through the positives and the negatives of the co-production. And when we're thinking about an international Australian film, co-production certainly has to become part of the conversation. There have been a lot of American and Australian co-productions over the last few years, and Britain and Australia has a long tradition of co-productions, mostly through the Ealing Studios, which did a number of successful and very interesting co-productions during the 1940s and the 1950s. But today I want to talk about the China and Australian co-production, and the China and Australian co-production is a fairly recent thing. It's due to a change in screen policy, and it is a difficult thing when you actually think about the differences between the two cultures. So, what's interesting about 33 Postcards is it really is Australia represented through a Chinese lens. So, this is a film that's really about the multicultural experience. And the multicultural experience comes through the director, Pauline Chan. Pauline Chan is really an international Australian director, if you want to think about that. She's not just an Australian director with sort of international ideas and sentiments. She's certainly an international director because of her own background, her own cultural background, and now her own residency in Australia. So she was born in Vietnam. She has Chinese parents. She completed her education in Hong Kong. She studied cinema in America, and she moved to Australia in the 1980s. So she certainly has this whole sort of back and forth idea with Asia and sort of the West, certainly through Australia. And she's really interested about those different experiences, certainly of Asians in Australia and most definitely Chinese in Australia. And if you actually think about the central character of the film, Mimi, she is a Chinese girl looking at Australia through her cultural gaze. So think about the director, and she is someone who's actually come to Australia from China, and you've got the central character. So you can sort of see that the central character in a way represents the own sort of gaze or the own idea that the director has of and on Australia. Now, there is a link here to Finding Nemo, and I know you'll probably laugh at the idea. If you actually think of Finding Nemo, what you've got is a non-Australian making a film, making a representation of Australia, and the central character also isn't Australian. Now, there's been a number of Australian films, a number of great Australian films like Wake and Fright and Walkabout that are very much Australian films, but they're actually directed by foreigners. And we can't just dismiss a film because it's not directed by an Australian as not being an Australian film. Non-Australians directing films is really, really important to Australia and Australian sense of identity just through how others look at Australia. And I think 33 Postcards is really interesting because here you've got a director who lives in Australia and has been in Australia since the 1980s. But she would say that her cultural sentiments are still very much in China. So it's a really interesting film where you've got this director who's sort of caught between these two countries and how she is representing Australia. Now, Pauline Chan said this, what she really liked about 33 Postcards is the prospect of being able to write, direct and produce a film that could reach an international audience. So here is an Australian film. It's not actually made for Australia, or predominantly Australia. It's actually made for the international. And what does that actually mean? To actually make a film that is for the international. So there's this whole thing about Hollywood that, Hollywood isn't actually about America. It's actually about the global. So to be Hollywood, to be global. And that's kind of what she's thinking about with a film like this. And it's also where Australian cinema has us sort of gone, if you actually think of a film, say, like Mad Max or a film like Baz Luhrmann's Australia. These are very much films made for the international audience. So the film is really about breaking down myths and, thinking about the myths of Australia, Australian stereotypes, and what we've actually seen through a lot of Australian films. So you've got the central, not central character, but Dean, which is played by Guy Pearce. He represents himself as a stereotypical Aussie male. So he writes, the whole film is about him writing letters to Mimi, and then she comes to actually see this fictional character, and he's represented himself in a very sort of romantic, heroic sort of way, and she comes to see the reality, and the reality is he's actually in jail. So in the letters that he's writing to her over a number of years, he represents himself as a great man, a hero, Australian hero, a park ranger. He's a family man. He's an all-round good guy. And as we will soon discover, his reality is really not like that. Now, Australia is also really interesting. It's when she comes to Australia, her idea of Australia is this mythically exotic land. But when she comes to Australia, the reality is a lot darker, and it's much darker. And that's where I think what's really interesting about the film, that it's actually about exposing this sort of dark underbelly of Sydney, this crime syndicate of Sydney. And of course, the central character gets caught into this crime syndicate, and Guy Pearce has to save it. So he essentially does become the hero, even though I don't want to ruin the ending for you. Now, when you actually think about how the film is representing Australia, the question I put to you is this a positive representation of Australia? Now, often when Australians are making international Australian films for an international audience, Australia is represented as that exotic land, the beach, and what the beach represents. And there's another film that I do want to talk about called Bait, which is sort of it was a Singapore Australian co-production, and it starts on the beach, and the beach is always this beautifully exotic place, and people want to come to Australia to go to the beach. But in 33 Postcards, Australia's almost like this sort of cautionary tale of the real Australia and the underbelly of Australia. And think about how that's different to, say, Baz Luhrmann's Australia, or the Ned Kelly film. Those sorts of films where Australia is such a beautifully scenic looking place. And you don't really get that in 33 Postcards. And I think that's really interesting. And often when Australians watch Australian films, you do get that, that beautifully scenic sort of postcard-esqueness going on. And you don't really get it in this film. Now, the film shifts. So basically, Mimi comes to Australia, and what she's expecting to be part of, the film she wants to be part of, is this family drama, right? She's going to meet Dean. He's going to be this great family man, and she's going to live at his house with his great family. And what she gets herself into is this prison film, this crime film, which again is this long tradition in Australia of the prison film and the crime film. So the film does shift in style and tempo quite dramatically, and I would actually argue that this has caused problems of the structure. So if you're watching this film and you think it doesn't actually work, I want you to really think about, okay, why isn't this working? What is the film actually trying to do? Now, what's interesting about the Mimi character of Dean is that both are outsiders, and again, this is very true to the Australian character type of films about outsiders. And if you think of a lot of Australian films, a lot of them are actually about outsiders. And, again, that's been another criticism of Australian films actually not being able to reach international markets, because Australians are so interested in the tragic hero and the outsider, where, in America, it's not so much really about that. So the problems for the Chinese and Australian co-production, and if you actually think about it, how do these two nations come together? And there's so many cultural and social differences to each country, it's going to be really hard for them to actually engage. So you've got the cast, right? So you've got Australian stars, and then you've got Chinese stars. Now in Australia, most Australians aren't aware of Chinese stars, and the only stars that Chinese are aware of are the big Hollywood stars, which is why Guy Pearce becomes very important for this film. The language, there is a clear difference in the language. So you've essentially got a film where you've got two cultures with two different languages, and how is that actually going to gel? Because the fact is, audiences do not like going to a film and reading subtitles. Now, I'm not talking about us, I'm just talking about the general population, that most foreign language films will not do nearly as well as most English-speaking language films. So how do you actually overcome that when you've actually got some characters in one nation speaking, so Mandarin, characters in another nation speaking English. So it's going to become a real problem, and that's always been a problem with, say, Chinese films playing Australian films playing in China, and it's always going to be a continuing problem of Australian films being in co-production with Chinese films. So that's something to think through, how do you actually overcome that? And something I'll put to you, I think it's really interesting when you're watching this film and they're not speaking English. You actually watch an Australian film that actually isn't in that ochre sort of Australian English sort of language. It's really interesting. Now, a rigid requirement of the Australian-China co-production treaty was making decisions on budget, location, casting, and crew according to its rules. So there's particular rules on for it to be a co-production, it has to have this much of Australia in it, it has to have this much of China in it. And that's always going to become a problem when you've got two such distinct nations as China and Australia. And as Pauline Chan said, Australia is a largely white Anglo-Saxon society with British sensitivities. So it's not going to have the Chinese sensitivities, and that's going to become a real problem in and of itself. So Pauline Chan again, she said this, for the Chinese market, the hero's journey is very important. It promises action and suspense. The Australian angle is the opposite. Our Australian distributors and producers are interested in the little girl coming to look for her sponsor. They're interested in a warm-hearted story about a little girl looking for a father. So this becomes the real problem of the film. Like, whose film is it? Is it the hero's film or is it the girl's film? And you've got two countries actually wanting different things from their own cinema. So then you've got a clash. So again, if you think the film isn't working, think about that problem and the compromise that you have to make from the Chinese perspective and you have to make from the Australian perspective. And it would have been very difficult to actually work through all of these issues for the film producers. Now, the positives of co-production are quite huge. So it increases financing options, not only by bringing new producers on board, but also by tapping into two or more sets of government investment incentives. So it can lower production costs by accessing lower costs or lower currency and production elements. Right, if you're doing a co-production with another nation where it might be cheaper to shoot in that nation, it might be cheaper to use their crews and things like that. So it becomes very, very significant, and that was the case certainly for Americans shooting in Australia. Things have sort of changed, and they're really trying to keep now American productions in America. But the runaway production has always been based on that whole idea that other countries are willing to give more for less. So what else? Another positive of the co-production is it raises the overall budget. So average cost of a non-production is $5 million. Non-co-production is $5 million in Australia, but the average cost of a co-production is $10 million. So there's another reason. You can actually get a lot more money through the co-production. And of course, it increases the marketing opportunities. And this is why you get a lot more investors coming on board. Because with a film like 33 Postcards, to get the film into China is huge, and I'll talk about that, because you're just going to get the film on so many screens, whereas in Australia, and only Australia, it's going to struggle to, probably crack maybe 100 screens. So America has opened its doors to more distribution of Chinese films in the hope that such favours will be returned. So basically China is the growing cinema market as far as exhibition goes, right? Like, there's no market that's growing quite at the rate of China. And America are trying to get all of their films into China, but it's really difficult because China are very restrictive of how many foreign films play in China. So this means, right, that the Australian-China co-productions are more likely to find an American distribution on the back of being a Chinese film. And the reason why, because what America have done is that they've kind of opened the floodgates to Chinese films. They've made it very easy for Chinese films to be distributed and exhibited in America. Now, the hope is that China will return the favour and they will allow a lot more American films to play in China. But the trick for a film like 33 Postcards, which can actually sell itself as a Chinese film, is that film therefore is going to become it's going to be very easy for that film to actually be exhibited and distributed in America, because it's in America's best interest to be very kind to Chinese films, because they're hoping that will return the favour and a lot more American films will get into China. Now, what is Chinese about the film, like what is Australian? So the Australian-China co-production must show that they are sufficiently Australian and sufficiently Chinese. Like, again, this is going to become a real problem with a film you've got such two clashing nations. A film classified as foreign is liable to the quota restrictions placed on the distribution of foreign films. So it's about 20 films a year, 20 foreign films a year that they allow into China. And that's not very much. So if this film can actually be considered as Chinese, then the film can play in China, and it doesn't actually have to undergo, that distribution or the quota system. So again, it's going to be it's in its best interest for this film to be as Chinese as possible, so it can actually sell itself as Chinese, and it can actually be labelled as Chinese when it comes to being exhibited in China. Now, Australia needs China, China does not need Australia, says director Pauline Chan. And think about that, and think about why that's so important to Australia and Australia's stability as a film industry, Australia's growing stability as a film industry, that we really do need to be making, these co-productions with China work for both countries, for China and for Australia. You may want to think, what's in it for China? If you actually think, like the top end producers in China probably do want to work with America because they've got the capital for that, but the lower producers are actually more likely to work with Australia just because both nations are very close to each other, and you can actually get more sort of bang for your buck from working with Australian producers and directors than, say, in America. Now, the question is, what lengths should Australia go to denationalise its films to reach this Chinese market? And what's really interesting about 33 Postcards is I actually don't think it sells out its Australianness in any level. I think it's a very Australian film, and you could actually say that's the problem of the film, that it's trying too hard to stay true to the Australian film, and it's trying too hard to appeal to a Chinese film audience. But here you've got sort of two examples. So one is 33 Postcards. This is the Chinese poster, and think about what's sort of on display here. Guy Pearce and the Sydney Opera House and the Sydney Harbour. You've got all of that. Then you've got this other film called Bait. I don't know if you've seen Bait. I was actually going to put Bait in the course, but I just couldn't do it to myself or to you to actually watch through this film yet again. And the thing about Bait is it starts on a beach, and then there's this tsunami, and suddenly we all end up in this flooded underground supermarket with this crazy shark swimming around the supermarket, basically eating people. Now, it's this co-production between Singapore and Australia, but it's sort of this nowhere land that Australia isn't really represented as any particularly distinctive place, because the whole idea is if it's sort of a nowhere land and it's an everywhere land, it can be sold anywhere and everywhere. Now, the film did really well, so you can sort of make this argument, I suppose, that by not making it specifically Australian, even though it is Australia, that it actually appeals more greatly to an international market. I don't know. 33 Postcards is interesting, and 33 Postcards is really interesting because it is an independent sort of art house film. So to make an Australian-Chinese co-production and make it an art house film, I think is really interesting. And the question is, do we want more films like 33 Postcards, which is sort of more the independent, character-centred film, or do we want films like Bait, which is just these action explosions and sharks eating people and all of that. When you think about it, it's actually, there's a lot more credibility in a film like 33 Postcards, and you sort of got to respect what 33 Postcards is trying to do. In a way, both films don't entirely succeed in what they are trying to achieve, but I would actually much rather watch 33 Postcards again than Bait. Now, Australian Stars is really important. Australian Stars becomes really important to international co-productions. Now, when you're thinking about, so you think about a film like Bait, which sort of just denationalises all the Australianness out of itself, right? And then 33 Postcards works, right, because of Guy Pearce, because he is an international star. And that's the important thing. And this is why it's so important for Australian actors to be working in Hollywood and getting known and becoming international stars. Because what it does is it gives them an international appeal, right? So, say Guy Pearce, he goes to America and he appears in a number of highly profile films. Suddenly he's a marquee star. Suddenly in China they know exactly who Guy Pearce is. So when you come to a smaller film like 33 Postcards, right? If Guy Pearce is starring in the film, Guy Pearce can actually make that film happen because of his star appeal, his international star appeal. Because what Guy Pearce has come to now represent is Australia and America, because he plays Americans in America, he plays Australians in Australia, right? So it actually works really well for Guy to put himself in a film like this. The film can get up, and the film can actually do really well, on a sort of an international scale, because everybody's interested in the whole Guy Pearce. So it's really important when we're sort of thinking about Australians staying in Australia and actors staying in Australia. It's actually really important that Australian stars and Australian actors go around the world and star in different sorts of films around the world, because it gives them marquee status. And when those actors come back, okay, they can actually get bigger budgets, they can get bigger box office just because of their own international celebrity. And I think Guy Pearce has done that really well. He's managed his own celebrity really well. He's very committed to the Australian cinema, is Guy Pearce. And if you actually look at his filmography, it's probably sort of half in America and half in Australia. But he really is interested in the smaller films, the independent films, and a film like 33 Postcards is a really good example of that. One criticism I think you could have with the casting of 33 Postcards is there's no Chinese star. And that's, I think, a little bit odd when you're thinking you're actually trying to appeal to a Chinese market here. They have Guy Pearce, but they don't have a Chinese star. And you may want to think about, why they wouldn't have done that. I actually think it was a casting mistake in many ways. Okay, so just the shooting, it was filmed over 4 weeks in Sydney and 1 week in China. Now, Pauline Chan said this about the shooting. The Australian government is more unbending, rigid and demanding than the Chinese government. In China, the director was seen as the creative voice and its government was happy to bend the rules to make the co-production go ahead. In Australia, money had to be spent on bringing more Chinese cast and crew to Australia, racking up costs on flights and hotel bills. So when we're thinking about that question yet again, what is an Australian film? It is interesting how you've got the government sort of making these hard and fast rules, the Australian government, saying this is an Australian film, and for it to be an Australian film, it has to do the following things. And it's only thinking about the production, the employment of the production crew. It's not actually thinking about the other things, the on-screen representation of what you can actually do with an Australian film. And is that a problem that we're only thinking about the employability of the crews, or should we be thinking more widely, more globally about the ways an Australian film could be many different things rather than just the employment of Australians in Australia? And that previous quote makes me think of last week's lecture, which I left the lecture with these 2 quotes by Ben Goldsmith. And he said, "My intention has been to encourage scholars of Australian cinema to consider the diversity of relations that constitute it, and not to be limited to understanding of Australian cinema that simply conform with categories developed by government agencies for their own purposes." So what he's saying is, let's actually get away from this whole idea that for it to be an Australian film, it has to be shot, here in Australia, for this amount of time, it has to have this sort of crew, and it has to do all of that. He says, let's get rid of all of that. Let's just start to think a little bit differently about Australian films and how Australian cinema and Australian film can be defined through many different ways and agencies. And then another quote was, "Rather than understanding Australian cinema as a territory, Australian international cinema is conceived as a space of relations." And I think that's really important for a film like 33 Postcards. It's so true for a film like 33 Postcards, this quote, that what is really being represented in this film is a space of relation, where you've got the Chinese space and the Australian space. And just to conclude, I just want to conclude with the release. So basically, we've got a $3.2 million budget, which isn't a very big budget at all. The film opens on 42 screens in Australia, which is it's not a big opening, and the film really didn't do well. But the film opens on 800 screens in China, and that is massive. That is huge business. So if you actually think about that, what a small film, and this is the thing about 33 Postcards, it's a small indie art house film, and it's opening on 800 screens in China. And that gives the potential for a huge box office without it actually being a success at all. And just the final question I leave you with is, if there is a problem with the Chinese and Australian co-production just through differences in national identity and national cultures and national society, what kinds of stories and aesthetic approaches might be workable as the basis for films that would find audiences in both countries? And what sort of films should we be thinking about making if we're actually going to continue these co-productions? And I think it's really important that these co-productions do continue. They are really important to the Australian industry. They're really important to the Chinese industry. The fact that China is now trying to reach out and stabilise its own national cinema by working with networks across the country. And Australia also needs to be really securing these co-production links with countries outside of Australia. Okay, I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoy 33 Postcards.